we're going to look at multiplying and dividing integers. And so as we look at this, our essential question is, can I multiply and divide integers? And just a reminder, integers are positive and negative numbers and include 0 as well. And so I want us to look at these patterns here that we have in these tables, because this is going to help us. So we can see, and again, write down everything that I write down, but we can see that we have a 3 times 3, and we know that's 9. We already wrote that in there, it's right there. And then we can see 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 times 1 is 3. And so what's happening here is we're going down, the value is going down. So I went from 3 to 2 to 1, and now what's 3 times 0? Well, it's 0. That is not a very good looking 0. Let's try that again. There we go. And so you'll also notice that each time we go down, we're going down by 3. We went from 9 to 6 to 3 to 0. And so let's talk about what we think a positive number times a negative would be. What's 3 times negative 1? If we go down 3 more, it's going to be a negative 3. And what's a positive times a negative? 3 times a negative 2. Well, that is going to be a negative 6. So we know that a positive times a positive is always going to give us a positive integer. That's something that we learned when we learned our multiplication facts in elementary school. But now let's talk about if I have a positive and I multiply it by a negative, what kind of answer did we get? We got a negative answer. So now let's go ahead and let's look at our other table here. Since we know a positive times a negative is going to be a negative, then I know 2 times a negative 3 is going to be that negative 6. 1 positive, 1 negative, always a negative. And 1 times negative 3 is going to be a negative 3. What about 0 times a negative 3? Well, anything times 0 is just 0. So as we look at our pattern here, we're going to look at, oh no, what happens when we have a negative times a negative? So I have a negative 1 times a negative 3. And what are we going to get? What's happening? We are increasing over here by 3 each time. So I went from negative 6 and I went to negative 3. I went up 3. I went from negative 3 to 0. And I'm going to go from 0 to positive 3. So we just learned that a negative times a negative is a positive. Let's look at our negative 2 times negative 3. What will it be? Well, it will be a positive 6. And what about a negative 3 times a negative 3? It will be a positive 9. So the product of two negative integers, product meaning the answer to a multiplication problem, is going to be a negative times a negative is a positive answer. So we know when the signs of the integers are the same, what do we know about our product? So we have to be careful, because when we know that they are the same, a positive times a positive is going to be a positive, and a negative times a negative is going to be a positive. So when those are the same, we know we're going to have a positive answer. These are examples of all of them being the same. I boxed it in. Let me change colors so you can see that. So these are examples of them being the same. And these are examples of where you have two negatives, meaning the same, so they're positive. And so what happens if the signs are different? So what happens when we have a positive and a negative? One is positive, one is negative. They are different. When they are different, we're going to have a negative answer. So I kind of want to go through this bottom part with you real quick and look at some examples. If I look at A, I know a negative and a negative. I know I'm going to have a positive answer. Even if we don't know exactly what 3 times 12 is, we know it has to be positive. And it is a 36. You don't need to put the plus sign. I'm just putting that there because we should be able to look at every single one and determine what it is. What about a negative times a positive? Well, I know that's going to be a negative answer. And how about you do the 7 times 9? Anything times 0 is 0. What about 9 times negative 11? So 1 positive, 1 negative. We know that's going to be a negative answer. What about a negative times a negative? Well, we know that's going to be a positive answer. And a positive times a negative is going to give us a negative answer. So fill in those values. Fill in the value of those. We determine together if they were positive or negative. Let's talk real quick. Notice about the rules for positive and negative numbers when you're multiplying and dividing. Let's talk about the rules for those. And what do you know about those rules? They are the same. So when you multiply or divide, you know what? I'm going to type it so we can read it a little better. When you multiply or divide integers, the rules are the same. So we just determined that whenever we multiply and divide, we have the same rules. We're going to practice on multiplying and dividing our integers, and that's all I have for you. Dividing. And what I think you're going to realize, and we're going to summarize it on the first page here in a second. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 6 divided by 3 is 2. Let's continue. 0 divided by 3 is 0. What about a negative 3 divided by a positive? Well, it's going to be a negative 1. What about a negative 6 divided by a positive? That's going to be a negative 2. Let's fill in my chart on the other side. 0 divided by a negative 3. Well, that's just 0. What about a negative 3 divided by a negative 3? Well, anything divided by itself is always just going to be 1. And a negative 6 divided by a negative 3, and that's going to be a positive 2. So look at all the positive integers. Positive divided by a positive. Check out your positives there. What kind of answer are you going to get? A positive answer. Good. What if I have a positive divided by a negative, or a negative divided by a positive? Any of the ones in blue, what kind of answer are we going to get? We are going to get a negative answer. What if they're both negative? If both of them are negative, what kind of answer do we get? We do. We get a positive. Let's talk about how we filled in these blanks compared to the other ones. If both the signs are the same, it's positive. And if both the signs are different, it's negative. So let's talk about, and I'll let you finish those examples in your notes. But let's talk about our summary real quick.